Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Family, Marriage and Household. In this module, we will deal with the concept of ideal family as understood mostly in terms of heteronormative one. And we will also deal with the idea of family, especially with regard to the sexual division of labor. Further, we will also deal with how transgressions from the normative expectations of family leads to violence, especially violence, gender-based violence. Further, in this module, the important keywords that we will discuss is heteronormativity, family, domestic work, domestic violence, public and private, marriage and household. Family, marriage and household. Introduction. Family, marriage and household have been theorized and discussed to a great extent by the discipline of sociology. One has seen these discussions through interactionist, evolutionist, diffusionist, functionalist and structuralist as well as interdisciplinary perspective. Structuralists approach family as a pattern of interrelated statuses and role at a particular time and as an organized pattern of interrelated rights and obligations of its members. The interactionists are concerned with the interaction between individual family members. The functionalist perspective has been an important locus of critique for the feminists. Functionalists maintain that any social institution needs to be understood in the context of the benefit it provides to both individuals and the society in which they live. Hence, according to them, family serves as an instrument purpose for its members as well as the society at large. They aspire for a fit between the family and the society. Functionalists also propound that with the changes in the society structure, the structure of the family changes. Talcott Parson argues in the context of Western society that a nuclear family system is best adapted to fit to the needs of an industrial society. For him, family must be characterized by values such as ascription, an emphasis upon who the people are, and particularism, priority for special relationships. He further points out that one of the ways in which disruption may be avoided is by segregating the nuclear family from the public sphere, thereby steer clear of a situation where a person has to choose between loyalty to kin and impersonal standards demanded by the occupational roles. By creating this divide between public and private, Parson, being essentially a modernist, described the function of the male family member of the family as instrumental and that the female member of the family is expressive. For sociologists and primarily functionalists, social institutions are essential components of a social life, family being an important one. The idea of marriage inevitably gets connected with the idea of family as a way to establish new kin connections and forming a household in which children are brought up. However, what counts as a family and who can marry who, its connections with other kins, the connection between marriage and sexuality differs in different societies. According to Giddens, family is a group of persons directly linked by kin connections, adult members of which assume responsibility for caring for the children. Kinship ties are connections between individuals established either through marriage or through the lines of descent that connect blood relatives. Marriage can be defined as a socially acknowledged and approved sexual union between two adult individuals. The definitions of kinship, marriage and family are intricately linked to each other and vary considerably across socio-cultural and historical context. In India, it may be difficult to draw a clear-cut distinction between nuclear and joint family. Though a couple and the child might be staying separately from the parents, the overall functioning of the household is often influenced by an extended family residing elsewhere. Family is defined by kin connections and kin connections may be defined by marriage or through lines of descent. Therefore, marriage becomes an inextricable part of the definition of family. Worsley points out that after marriage, the emphasis is on the conjugal bond to such an extent that marriage has become an index of normality or settling down. Further, marriage is defined by patrilocality, patrilineality, heterosexuality, monogamy and exogamy. In the Indian context, marriage outside one's caste, religion and class is considered dangerous and leads to drastic punishments or stigmatization by the society. Moreover, marriages by choice and not those arranged by the parents are still discouraged, and such relationships are seen with great suspicion. In order to maintain the fit between family and society, it is important for the institution to lay down the norms of behavior for the heterosexual couples engaged in a marital relationship. Especially, the relationship is defined by patrilocality, where the couple goes to live either near the parents of the groom or in the same house. Patrilineality implies that the lineage of a child born to the couple is derived from the father's family. In order to maintain the purity of this lineage, the sexual conduct of the married couple is of utmost importance. Therefore, the norms of monogamy, maintaining sexual relations only with the spouse, exogamy, marrying outside one's clan, and maintenance of one's caste, class, and religious background attains a non-negotiable status as far as the institution of family is concerned. Based on these ideals, a family assumes a heteronormative form. Heteronormativity refers to the overwhelming power of the assumption that heterosexuality is natural and normal and is the norm to be emulated. In the Indian context, religion, caste, class play an important role in constituting family members and specific normative forms of behavior. Andre Pete elucidates how family as an institution contributes to the reproduction of existing inequalities in similar forms. He identifies caste and class as important resources which contribute to the reproduction of inequalities in a family and subsequently in the society. Among the many shifts the family and kinship studies saw in India since the 1950s, an important one in reference to the household dimension of family has been the shift in interest from the morphology of the family to the political economy of the household and how it functions as a unit of production, reproduction and consumption in the wider society. Instead of following the conventional definition of family, A.M. Shah adopted a wider definition of the household to describe different types of families. He classified the household into two groups, simple and complex. Shah defined simple households as those consisting of whole or part of the parental family and complex households as consisting of two or more parental or part of the parental families. Feminists pointed out that it was not only important to look at the forms of families and what they represent, but also to investigate how families function in reality. Hence, a shift of focus from family to household was an important one. According to Gita, the household is a definite spatial location within which identifiable concrete transactions takes place between different members who inhabit this location across sex and age divisions. This shift from the ideological concept of the family to the concrete functioning of the household enabled feminists to draw attention to not only the form of family but the different ways in which women within the household are exploited and marginalized. Karlikar defines household as an operational unit which functions broadly within the parameters of a family and a kinship ideology. This would include rules of marriage, residence, property ownership, roles and functions determined according to age and gender. It may be surmised that household is an operational unit while family is an overarching conceptual unit. The trajectory of feminist thought on marriage, family and household will be discussed in the following section. Personal is political. Feminists critique the public-private divide. The concepts of institutions of family, marriage and household have been discussed and critiqued by feminists at length. The first wave liberal feminist critique of the family did not question the sanctity of the family as a unit but identified the problematic position of women in them. For them, a simple repair and reform strategy would elevate women from the subordination. Marxist feminists draw their critique of the family from Engels, The Origin of Family, Private Property and the State, where he argues that within the emergence of private property, production became more valued than the household. Household labor was devalued and this has led to the transformation of women into property of men, leading to the devaluation of female tasks, roles and responsibilities. Further, they point out that women are encouraged to be wives and mothers and such ideological coercion produces enormous benefits for capitalism. Radical feminists identify the sex and gender system as the root cause of oppression faced by the women in the family and suggest that patriarchal institutions need to be dismantled for radical alternatives. They attack the gender prescriptions inherent in naturalistic family discourse, where the family is projected to be an eternal, non-changing entity. The romantic picture of the family created by the functionalists was questioned by the feminists in a consolidated manner in the West from the 1960s onwards, and feminists in the Indian context from the late 1970s. Betty Friedan's book, A Feminine Mystic, 1963, opened up discussions on the private sphere. While elucidating the problem with no name, Friedan brought to the forefront the vagaries of the middle-class American housewives after the World War II. The directionless restlessness and the resultant lack of motivation to find meaning in one's life was lucidly discussed in her book. What it did for the American society was to lay bare the marginalization and silencing of women's experiences within the four walls of the house. By rejecting the myth that the only way women could find fulfillment was through child rearing and homemaking, Friedan opened up the romantic idea of the private sphere for being challenged. Kate Millett, in her book Sexual Politics, further prodded the public-private debate by questioning the very act of coitus. According to her, coitus can scarcely be said to take place in a vacuum, although of itself it appears a biological and physical activity. It is said so deeply within the larger context of human affairs that it serves as a changed microcosm of the variety of attitudes and values to which culture subscribes. Millett defined the problem with no name as rooted in sexual politics. Her work marked the beginning of looking at a relationship between the sexes in a political light, as a power structure relationship when one group of persons is controlled by another. This apart, the debates among the second wave feminists from the 1960s to the 1980s around abortion, sexuality, prostitution and pornography brought the previously silenced and tabooed issues within the public realm of discussion. Carol Hanish's paper titled Personal is Political in the Notes from the Second Year Women's Liberation was widely circulated and shared among feminists. It brought forth the realization that the problems faced by women are not personal problems, but they are political problems. They are not caused by the inability or inefficiency of a woman to perform the roles expected of her, but have a larger socio-cultural political context. While discussion in the West emerged around activism and theoretical works of the second wave feminists from the 1970s, the women's movement in India also began to question the sanctity of the family, state, and other patriarchal and ideological institutions. However, one cannot overlook the fact that home, family, and marriage relations were critical institutional sites for social reformers and early feminists in later 19th and 20th century. Now the critique was largely around the critique of tradition. But in the later part of the 20th century, the focus had shifted from the individual body of the victim and the tradition to patriarchal institutions which govern her experience. While there was a public outrage on rape beginning from Mathura case, dowry, issues of dowry-related deaths, female feticide sati were being discussed in the public domain. A series of legislations were passed in the 1980s, and it emerged to be the golden age of women-friendly laws. While the late 90s focused on dowry as a form of subordination of women in the family, the 1980s began to focus on relationships of women to and within the family by an examination of women's rights in marriage, divorce, property maintenance, which are governed by personal laws in India. The debate on personal laws was triggered in 1985 by the Shah Banu case, when a 5-member constitution bench of the Supreme Court ruled that 75-year-old Shah Banu was entitled to maintenance by a husband under Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. This case, which ultimately spiraled into a communal issue between the Hindus and the Muslims, was a crucial moment for the women's movement in India, because it was faced for the first time with the questions of a fractured identity of Indian women, and also brought forth the conflict between citizenship rights of a woman and community interest, and the role of the state in this tussle. These laws, though ineffective due to the poor implementation at the executive and judiciary level, failed to change the status quo of women. Women's movement welcomed these laws as a step towards empowerment of women, but only discovered much later that the motive of the state was only superficial and without any genuine concern for the rights of the woman. The lack of state willingness to bring about a change in the concrete everyday realities of women and the ineffectiveness of constitutional guarantees and legislations was highlighted by the 1974 report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, which was commissioned by the Government of India. The report challenged the existing discourses on issues of gender and economic well-being, political participation, law, health, and family welfare. It also ushered in a discussion on law as an instrument of social change, marriage, divorce, adoption, and guardianship, maintenance, inheritance, matrimonial property, and family codes. The campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s failed to ask difficult questions around women's chastity, virginity, economic rights within the family, but did manage to bring the family and household and the status of women within it into public discussion. Since the 1990s, discussion of sexuality and desire remains central to the feminist critique of family and marriage. According to Nivedita Menon, the institution that manages this policing of sexuality is patriarchal heterosexual family. The family as it exists is the core that sustains a social order. This normative form of the family, which discards different forms of its expression, have proved to be detrimental to men, women, and marginalized identities and their everyday lived experiences. Rinchin points out that families are also a context of violence, oppression, and restriction. She further argues that the overemphasis on family of a certain sort does not allow the exploration of any other relationship, and in the process, varied forms of desires and existence are either suppressed or denied. Moving away from the second wave of feminist slogan of personal is political, Rinchin argues that personal lived experience are what start the politics of thought and resistance. Then it becomes a job of politics to protect all kinds of personal plurality, to ensure its survival, and to nurture it with rightful security and dignity. An acceptance of the plurality of family forms continues to coexist simultaneously with the feminist argument to think of relationships beyond the institution of family. Production and reproduction. Feminists pointed out that the economic power of men and their control of production was linked with the organization of the family and the household. The roles assigned to men and women were not complementary in a society where men and women constitute unequal partners. As pointed out earlier, Marxist feminists contributed the unequal position of women in society to capitalist mode of production and private property. But radical feminists oppose this position and contend that unequal gender relations persist independent of the existing mode of production. Socialist feminists such as Hartman point out how capitalism and patriarchy work together to contribute to the exploitation of women. Socialist feminists have explained the material foundations of patriarchy in terms of men's control over women's labor power. Women are perceived to be responsible for housework and men for the reproduction of housework. The sexual division of labor maintains a hierarchy between the work done by men and women, rendering work done by women within the confines of the home as less valuable than that of the work done by men in the public domain. Cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and taking care of the elderly and the sick are all labor-intensive and time-consuming activities. Moreover, it provides men with a conducive home environment to regenerate themselves and be healthy and well-rested to work day after day. But this form of labor goes unacknowledged, and it is not even considered worthy of any remuneration. If a woman of a family do not perform domestic labor, then it is done by low-paid female domestic workers. Sexual division of labor is projected by mainstream society as a natural division of labor. However, feminists point out that there is nothing natural about sexual division of labor and that it is socially constructed and based on certain ideological assumptions. The sexual division of labor gets extended into the labor market as well when women go out to work in the public sphere. In this context, Beena Agarwal points out that the household factors interact with non-household factors to determine each party's bargaining power. Jobs such as nursing, teaching, domestic work are seen to be essentially female professions and are underpaid and undervalued. Women's roles at the workplaces are also seen in terms of an extension of the feminine roles of nurturing and caring. Unpaid housework and motherhood are perceived to be legitimate space of womanhood. Until Esther Bossorov's path-breaking study of women's contribution to economy, economists globally believed women's participation in economic activity was shaped by cultural attitudes and not by economic necessities. This belief continued to linger on for decades and to some extent still does in certain quarters, thus deflecting attention from an important factor underlying unequal development of women and men practically in all human societies, especially in the third world. Therefore, women's contribution in significant processes of human reproduction, biological reproduction, reproduction of labor force, and social reproduction are not only devalued but also invisibilized. Menon points out that the sexual division of labor is a source of sustenance for not only the family but also the economy because the burden of paid domestic labor would bear heavy on the husband or the employer. The employer does not pay for the domestic labor that enables the employee to come to the workplace in time. If all the employees of the husbands had to account for the work done by women at home, then the economy would fall apart. Feminists therefore bring forth the connection between unpaid work done at home and the way it sustains the national economy. The task for the feminist has been first, identification of household work as work, second, valuing that work, and third, questioning women's disadvantage in terms of pay. Women and work have a complex relationship in South Asian context. Women participation in workplace is often viewed with suspicion as it requires them to enter the public space. The engagement of women in the public sphere often leads them to being labeled as sexually permissive and immoral. In most of South Asia, the aesthetic of family claims on daughters, sisters, and wives and articulated in moral rather than material idiom. Work that is public paid labor may be perceived to be a violation of cultural expectations rather than a reinforcement of women's identities. Status considerations are violated every time a woman is forced to seek work to support herself and or her family, for it renders visible her male head of the household's inability to provide her with appropriate maintenance. Women's participation in work in the public sphere thus raises a number of issues. While at one level her character is questioned, at another level the ability of her husband to provide for her is put under the scanner. Her participation in work outside the confines of home is perceived to threaten her family and husband's honor, both in terms of sexual morality as well as the sexual division of labor. However, this may be negotiated differently in a lower class family where women are compelled to go out to work. Another issue to consider while discussing issues of honor is the ways in which women connect with her body in the workplace. If and how do employees make provisions for her bodily needs and discomforts? There are about 4 million domestic workers in urban India. How many of them can actually speak up for the right to use a toilet during long hours of work and travel? There are various ways in which women's body get connected with cultural beliefs of stigma, shame, purity, and pollution. How do they deal with the issues of stigma and shame that is associated with some forms of work? Women's experiences at workplace are shaped by all these considerations, and situations get even more grave when caste, class, and religious identities interplay with gender and work to their disadvantage. Falling from these perceptions, women often face multiple forms of violence both at home as well as workplace, where their claim for rights may be perceived as transgression from femininity. Violence at workplace is not simply a consequence of failure to perform duties, but it gets intricately linked with a female identity, a resentment of a grit, and determination to strive and struggle against all odds. This apart, the competition that women bring to the labor market upsets the hierarchy and monopoly of male breadwinners perpetuated through the sexual division of labor. While issues of wages, working hours, social security are of great importance as far as discussions of women and work is concerned, what often gets overlooked is issues of intimacy, pleasure, and leisure at the disposal of these women. How does the mental health of women get affected when a majority of them are expected to do a double shift with no time left for themselves? Moreover, there is an abundant amount of emotional labor that a woman puts in both at workplace as well as at her home. Women are expected to be peacemakers, pacifiers, conflict solvers, apart from the other normative and professional roles that they are expected to perform at the home and the place of work. All this labor goes unacknowledged under the grab of labor for love. Violence, family to the state. The form of family, which is based on normative notions of heterosexuality, monogamy, patrilineality, and patrilocality, is inherently violent. Though mainstream sociologists have ignored the social pathology concerning family, Oberoi points out that family is also the site of exploitation and violence. Marriage, which is perceived to be the foundation stone of a family, requires the woman to reshape and remake the self to fit into the family of her husband. In fact, a large part of the woman's life is spent in preparing for this singular event of marriage, from making career or job related choices to making choices about appropriate behavior and clothing to be a suitable girl. An institution, the edifice of which is built around such violent grounds, perpetuates violence on women in various forms. In the natal family, violence may take the form of infanticide, feticide, child sexual abuse, discrimination in terms of allocation of resources, and in the marital family, violence may take the form of dowry-related violence, marital rape, domestic violence. Transgressions from the normative code of behavior expected of women within the family leads to violence of various forms. Karlikar points out that violence is used to discipline and control women's bodies and desires. The meaning and definition of domestic violence has changed within the women's movement from 1980s, when it was used to refer to the murder of women who were burned because the family failed to meet the demands of dowry, to the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005, which includes sexual, emotional, economic as well as verbal forms of violence apart from physical forms. The issue was first raised as kitchen deaths that due to accident by investigating officers. They were later referred to as dowry deaths when dowry was identified as a cause of the death. Feminists first protested against police inaction and highlighted that these were not deaths but murders. The 1961 dowry prohibition was fraught with problems and had limited understanding of dowry and consequently the violence faced by women. The campaigns by the women's movement and recognizing the deaths of women in families not merely as death but as murders brought about a change in the Indian Penal Code in 1983 through sections 498A, cruelty to wives, which recognized for the first time the violence faced by women within their marital homes. Prior to this, there was no law which specifically addressed the violence faced by women within their home. Husbands were convicted under the provision for murder, section 302, wrongful confinement and abetment to suicide, section 306. In 1986, another amendment was made to the IPC to section 304B, which focused specifically on dowry deaths. Feminists emphasized on the need for a separate law because first, it was difficult to get witnesses as violence took place within the confines of home, and second, routine and consistent beating may cause more harm than the grievous hurt defined by the general provisions, but might not be as evident. But ever since these campaigns and laws, the rate of conviction in such cases has been extremely low, and so is the rate of completion of these trials. The police, who often reflect the mainstream mindset, refuse to register cases filed by women and force them to return to their marital family. The other fallout of the emphasis on the dowry-related murders was that other forms of violence intersected by religion, caste, class, community, and family, camouflaged and registered or referred to as dowry-related violence. The Domestic Violence Act was enacted in September 2005, and it acknowledged that domestic violence is a widely prevalent and universal problem of power relationships. The Act made departure from penal provisions which hinged on stringent punishment to positive reliefs of production and injection. The Act reduced the role of the police to the minimum, and to provide information about the Act to the women, direct them to the protection officer with the help of the enforcement of orders. Women dependency on lawyers reduced as social workers and designated NGOs help women to access the courts and obtain orders from using simple formats. But this act is also weighed down with challenges and shortcomings: lack of sensitive judges, lack of convergent model, clear direction to the stakeholders about the roles and responsibilities. Judicial pronouncements which limit the scope of the act have been the major hurdles in its effective implementation. Moreover, despite several legislations and awareness campaigns, women often do not discuss the violence they face in the marital family with the natal family. They feel a sense of embarrassment and shame as they feel that they could be held responsible for bringing dishonor to the family. Fear of losing their honor in society, often family members who are aware of the violence inflicted on their women refrain from taking any action. This further leaves the issue unaddressed and the woman in isolation to bear in pain. Women's movement struggle against domestic violence has often led to an alignment with women on other connected issues. For instance, anti-Iraq movements of women mobilized against government policy on liquor as a response to domestic violence. Feminists have pointed out that there is a relationship between violence faced by the woman in the family and in the interest of the state. In conclusion of the module titled Family, Marriage and Household, the students have dealt with the idea of ideal and also the idea of family. We have also examined the linkages between family, marriage and household. Further, Drawing on the feminist critique of family, we have also understood the various dimensions to the understanding of family. Further, we have briefly looked into the women's movement and their interlinkages, especially in terms of understanding, conceptualizing, and theorizing family and marriage. Further, based upon the whole issues of domestic violence and family, we have also touched upon briefly gender-based violence. Thank you.